So now let's address the question, what's the impact of the industrial age on workers' lives? Okay, so the quality of life for the average American industrial worker was pretty low. Um, Workers worked for very low wages, entire families worked. You had to have everyone in the family or even the extended family working in order to make ends meet, to be able to feed everyone. Housing conditions were poor. And workers in this early industrial age were, in a sense, extremely powerless. So these managers and company owners determined the wages, the hours they worked, and the conditions that they worked in. So workers were largely at the mercy of the owners and controllers of these various industries. Now, northern wages were a little bit higher than southern wages, but laborers were exploited. They often worked 12-hour days or more, worked 6 to 7 days a week. If you were working in the steel industry or in mining, it was common to work 7 days a week. If you were working in the seamstress industry, in a garment factory, you were likely working 12 to 14-hour days. The wages were set by company owners. Children made on average a quarter a day, and women worked on average for about $250 a year. Okay, that would have been their average annual earnings, and men would make less than $500 a year. Okay, whereas Andrew Carnegie was making $23 million in a year. Your 4,000 millionaires in America at the late 19th century were making and keeping most of the wealth. So these laborers were, in a sense, powerless in their industries. They had no benefits like vacation, or if they got hurt on the job, there was no compensation for that. They had no power to negotiate for higher wages. And the work that they performed was often monotonous and mind-numbing and made injury more likely. And then the conditions of the factories that they worked in was often dangerous, overcrowded, no sanitation, poor ventilation. So the conditions were unhealthy, overall poor. And then when laws were passed to regulate industries, some of the work was outsourced, especially in the garment industry, and people worked in what became sweatshops in their tenements. Many immigrants worked. As you can see, this tenement dwelling is an overcrowded, poorly ventilated, small apartment room. And people would bring pieces of garments home, and they themselves and their children would work into the late hours of the night and early hours of the morning in this outsourcing type of labor. Okay, so as businesses consolidate, labor attempts to consolidate. Laborers joining together in union so that their collective power can fight back at management and business owners and be a negotiating tool for better working conditions and better pay. So what are some of the early unions, and what do we see them do? One of America's first labor unions, and just a brief side note here, labor unions have been around in the United States since the 1700s. Most of them were guilds, but this is a national, what we're talking about here is a national organization to unite laborers across the United States, was the National Labor Union, the NLU, the National Labor Union, forms in 1868, and one of their first successes is for government employees. Government employees will get an 8-hour work day if you're a civil servant. Congress passes that law in 1868, and it's because of the advocacy of the National Labor Union. Now, discrimination is prevalent. They do not admit Black membership. And so we see a separate colored National Labor Union formed because of the rejection of the NLU in Black members. The second very powerful and larger labor union was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was open to all people, men and women, which is extremely unique, people of all immigrant and ethnic backgrounds, and people of all races. The Knights of Labor was one of America's first large membership labor union. The Knights of Labor liked to use arbitration, meaning they wanted to negotiate, have a middleman to negotiate between labor and management. They did not like to use the strike. They were also a labor union that included both skilled and unskilled employees or laborers. And one of the last things that makes them extremely unique is their platform of equal pay for equal work. That's something that even today is not guaranteed in many states, like equal pay for men and women for doing the same work. So that's something that the Knights of Labor advocated for. They supported equal pay and an 8-hour day. Okay, so there's a diverse kinds. There are diverse kinds of labor unions. You have craft unions, and then you have industrial unions. Craft unions focus on more skilled laborers. You might have like a police's union or a firefighter's union, or there was even like a cigar maker's union. Those are your craft unions. One of America's first craft unions was founded by the Jew Samuel Gompers, and he founded the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. They liked to use the strike. Now, a strike is a work stoppage, and they viewed it as the most powerful tool of laborers. What they had was their work, and they could get companies to come to the table and bargain with them if they stopped working. So the AFL used the strike and saw it as its most powerful tool. And throughout the late 1800s, 19th century, they saw some successes. They were able to win higher pay and a shorter work week using the strike. We're talking about the American Federation of Labor. And then these industrial unions were much more diverse and usually included mostly unskilled laborers. One of America's first industrial unions was the ARU, or the American Railway Union, that was founded by Eugene Debs. Debs also used the strike. Over time, pictured here in the lower right corner, Debs became disgruntled with the lack of progress that he saw in making change with working conditions and pay and the number of hours that workers worked during the week and benefits that they needed. And so what his ideas and principles changed to become much more socialist, and he founded the labor union called the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, and the members are called Wobblies. This is a socialist labor union. So socialism is an economic concept that's based on the principles of shared resources. And in the most extreme forms of socialism or communism, you would have to have like a bloody overthrow of the entire capitalist system and like kill the bourgeoisie and the proletariats or the working class, institute a new social order. This was seen as scary to many business owners, the radical ideas of the Wobblies. Now, mind you, most people who were members of the IWW did not share the most extreme and radical ideas of socialism. So it was radical, and it did include membership of minorities like African Americans. And then we see in the West some farm workers, Japanese and Mexican farm workers, are inspired by this labor wave, the power that laborers are exerting in they themselves. They don't form very powerful labor unions, but they start to unionize at a local level and advocate for better working conditions. Okay, and the strikes of the late 19th century, some of them turn violent. So the Great Strike of 1877 was a strike on the Baltimore and Ohio rail line, and we know what a strike is. It's a work stoppage. And these labor union members, one of the ways that they keep the strike going is to stop strike breakers or non-union workers from coming in and picking up the work. So when scabs or strike breakers come in, these strikes become violent. The B&O rail line is down for about a week. About 50,000 miles of track is down. We're talking about not just industrial cargo, but also passenger lines are down. And so the federal government steps in, federal troops come in and intervene to end the strike. So the Great Strike of 1877, the American Railway Union was the union that agreed to strike for rail laborers. And then the Haymarket Affair happens about 10 years later. It happens in the 1880s. It's inspired by the Great Strike of 1877. So this happens in Chicago. You've got workers from McCormick's Mechanical Reaper Mill that are organizing, and they're actually striking against police brutality, police officers who they feel like are violent as they organize protest. So there's a protest against police brutality, and some of the speakers are getting ready to speak. Someone throws a bomb in the police line, and when the smoke clears, there are several police officers who are dead, and a few of the speakers that were there for this rally. Well, 8 people are found guilty for violence, and all of them are union members, and they're organizers of the rally. 4 people are hanged. And this kind of turns the tide a little bit against labor because of the violent, radical nature of that Haymarket Affair. The Homestead Strike happened at one of Carnegie's mills in Pennsylvania. So Homestead, Pennsylvania is the location of a strike. Carnegie was going to cut the wages of steel workers, and they decided to strike against that. They barricaded the mill so that scabs or strike breakers couldn't come in. And so Fisk, who's the mill manager, he calls in the Pinkerton detective agency, and so there's firing between the strikers and the Pinkerton Detection Agency, and ultimately the National Guard has to be called in, and they reopen the plant. A lot of the employees lose their jobs, those that tried to strike, and steel workers won't try and mobilize again for almost 45 years. Now, we talked about the Pullman Company strike in The only thing I want to add, guys, about the Pullman Company strike, you can go back and review those notes, is that at the end of the strike, the employees were blacklisted. Those that were fired were blacklisted, meaning that they couldn't find employment in other industries. So industrial titans and the government seem to be working together in cahoots to oppress laborers. What about women in organizing? Women have a couple of goals. They are largely working in the garment industry, and they want better working conditions, shorter hours, better wages. But many women also want to see change in child labor laws. Mary Harris Jones is a prominent labor leader who organizes a march of mill children on Washington, D.C. in 1904. She marches them to Teddy Roosevelt's White House. Many of them are maimed from working in mills. These children want a future, an opportunity for an education, and because they have to work every day, all day, they don't have that. And then in 1909, women in the garment industry, the International Ladies Garment Workers, they win a strike, and they get higher wages, but it's a lot of the working conditions aren't improved. But in 1911, with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and 450 women dying in a fire because they get locked in a building because management's scared they're going to steal something, that changes the status quo. And the women's garment industry